Humanism increasingly designates an inclusive sensibility for our species, planet, and lives. Inclusive humanism is enlarging its constituency among Homo sapiens to consider man's broadening powers and obligations. This is resonant of Renaissance humanism to me, as it seems to make room for species governance. And such a proactive stance is charged with commensurate responsibility surpassing that of individual humanism. It identifies pollution, militarism, nationalism, sexism, poverty, and corruption as being persistent and addressable human character issues compatible with the interests of our species. It asserts that human governments must be unified and is inclusionary in that it does not exclude any person by reason of their collateral beliefs or personal religion alone. As such, it can be said to be a container for a more open humanism, instilling a species credo to complement the personal tenets of individuals that it had focused on in the past. Polemics about humanism have sometimes assumed paradoxical twists and turns. Earliest 20th century critics such as Ezra Pound, T.E. Hume, and T.S. Eliot considered humanism to be sentimental slop, Hume, or overly feminine, Pound, and wanted to go back to a more manly, authoritarian society, such as they believed existed in the Middle Ages. Postmodern critics, who are self-described anti-humanists, such as Jean-Francois Lyotard and Michel Foucault, have asserted that humanism posits an overarching and excessively abstract notion of humanity or universal human nature, which can then be used as a pretext for imperialism and domination of those deemed somehow less than human. Philosopher Kate Soper notes that by faulting humanism for falling short of its own benevolent ideals, anti-humanism thus frequently secretes a humanist rhetoric. In his book Humanism, 1997, Tony Davies calls these critics humanist anti-humanists. Critics of anti-humanism, most notably Jürgen Habermas, counter that while anti-humanists may highlight humanism's failure to fulfill its emancipatory ideal, they do not offer an alternative emancipatory project of their own. Others, like the German philosopher Heidegger, considered themselves humanists on the model of the ancient Greeks, but thought humanism only applied to the German race, and specifically to the Nazis, and thus, in Davies' words, were anti-humanist humanists. Such a reading of Heidegger's thought is itself deeply controversial. Heidegger includes his own views and critique of humanism in a letter on humanism. Davies acknowledges that after the horrific experiences of the wars of the 20th century, it should no longer be possible to formulate phrases like the destiny of man or the triumph of human reason without an instant consciousness of the folly and brutality they drag behind them. For it is almost impossible to think of a crime that has not been committed in the name of human reason. Yet, he continues, it would be unwise to simply abandon the ground occupied by the historical humanisms. For one thing, humanism remains on many occasions the only available alternative to bigotry and persecution. The freedom to speak and write, to organize and campaign in defense of individual or collective interest, to protest and disobey, all these can only be articulated in humanist terms. Peter Singer, the neo-utilitarian philosopher, has criticized humanism as speciesist. He commends the latest council of secular humanisms, the affirmation of humanism, a statement of principles, as aspiring to avoid needless suffering on other species. But Singer maintains that humanists do not define needless suffering adequately. He believes humanists should take a stronger stand for protectionism of species, and that they are still caught in the conceptual trap of the biblical permission to oppress other species. There have been some signs of late that humanists have started to take note of animal rights. John Gray in Straw Dogs, 2002, finds that many thinkers run together two irreconcilable philosophies, humanism and naturalism. Darwin's theory shows the truth of naturalism. We are animals like any other. Our fate and the rest of the life on earth are the same. Yet, in an irony all the more exquisite because no one has noticed it, Darwinism is now the central prop of the humanist faith that we can transcend our animal natures and rule the earth. One might answer Gray's criticism by affirming that humanism does not aspire to ruling the earth, but to making the minds of people freer, more rational, and more respectful of the dignity of all life in order to bring about a flourishing for all species on our planet. Logical Positivism. Logical Positivism is a school of philosophy concerned with empiricism in combination with rationalism. It is no longer considered a robust theory since W.V. Quine, the 20th century philosopher, took a fine scalpel to the logical positivist sharp-edged theory and disproved its principles so deftly that it never fully recovered. However, logical positivism is of interest to atheists for its statements that linguistic concepts of God and belief in God were meaningless. The positivists were also ruthless critics of the propaganda put out by the Nazi Third Reich prior to World War II. They ridiculed and savaged the hate-riddled statements issuing from the German Nazi Party. Their anti-Nazi activity is important to many secular humanists. The group was called the Vienna Circle originally, and the positivists gathered at the Café Central in Vienna before the war. In the 1920s and 1930s, Otto Neurath's efforts made the group more widely known. Most of the logical positivists in the circle were social and physical scientists by training, rather than philosophers. In 1929, Neurath, Rudolf Carnap, and Hans Hahn issued a pamphlet that summarized the circle's position on its philosophy. Their most important statement for the purposes of this lecture was that the circle found metaphysics not wrong per se, but unintelligible. The Vienna Circle dispersed with the rise of the Nazi Party in the early 1930s. Many of its members arrived in England and the United States, where they had a significant influence on philosophy. The Vienna Circle was influenced by the early work of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell, both influential 20th century philosophers. It was dominant as a philosophy of science until the Cold War. The most important tenet of the logical positivists is what they maintained concerning truth claims. They said that a statement makes a genuine truth claim is true or false if and only if it is either empirical, testable by sense experience, or analytical, true by definition. I was not going to get into this, but I am pretty confident that I can explain the difference between analytic and synthetic statements in an explicable way, and then what W.V. Quine did to blow up the distinction made by the logical positivists. It's an important concept, and when Quine undid it, he also undid the domination of the positivist school on philosophy for so many years. We might also keep in mind that it was Kant who first began the definition of analytic and synthetic statements. Analytic sentences are true by definition and are generally self-explanatory. Additionally, they often have little to no informative value. Does this sound like Hume? Yes. Examples of analytic sentences include, frozen water is ice, bachelors are unmarried men, two halves make up a whole. No additional meaning or knowledge is contained in the predicate that is not already given in the subject. Analytic sentences are redundant statements whose clarification relies entirely on definition. Analytic sentences tell us about logic and about language use. They do not give meaningful information about the world. Synthetic statements, on the other hand, are based on our sensory data and experience. The truth value of a synthetic statement cannot be figured out based solely on logic. If one had had no sensory input from the world, then studying the statement would not yield the meaning of the sentence as it would for an analytic sentence. Examples of synthetic statements are, children wear hats, the table in the kitchen is round, my computer is on. Synthetic sentences are descriptions of the world that cannot be taken for granted. Sentences that are possibly true but not necessarily true are synthetic. W.V. Quine argues in his extremely important piece, the 1962 Two Dogmas of Empiricism, that there is no clear argument supporting this distinction between analytic and synthetic sentences. That is, although some sentences appear to rely on nothing but logic and meaning for their truth values, no philosopher has been able to give a criterion which would clearly distinguish analytic from synthetic sentences. Quine suggests that this is because sentences have meaning only in reference to a larger body of knowledge. Thus, the first example above, which states frozen water is ice, has been taken by philosophers to be analytic, but it actually derives its meaning from a wider body of knowledge about what it is to water. According to Quine, even a statement like this one, which seems to be true solely in virtue of the meanings of the words, relies on there having been some experience of the world in order for it to be meaningful. The positivist stated that the statement, God exists, fails the test since it's neither true nor false. It simply lacks cognitive meaning and only expresses some sort of vague feelings. They concluded that it is senseless to ask whether there is a God. A.J. Ayer, who wrote the impressive Language, Truth, and Logic in 1946, while still in his 20s, had a large influence in propagating logical positivism's theories. His work was taken up by many thinkers. Ayer was an atheist who saw religious language as defective and without meaning.